When mummifying dead bodies, the Egyptians discarded it. Hippocrates valued it as the interpreter of consciousness. Aristotle thought of it as a coolant for the blood. It, of course, is the brain. For thousands of years, the 3 pounds of matter inside our skulls has captivated scientists and lay people alike. While there is still a great deal to learn, we have come further in our understanding of the brain and its functions over the past 30 or so years than we had in all the prior centuries. Now, we recognize that the brain is the control center for the body and emotions. We know that it is in some respects malleable, and with the help of sophisticated imaging, we are starting to grasp the factors that influence the brain's development and its changes over the course of a lifetime. To help us dig into and appreciate the mysteries of the brain, we are honored to host tonight's special guests. First, we will hear from Takao Hensch, next from Jordan Smoller, and then from Justine Hardy. Lastly, they will have a conversation together, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Takao Hensch.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to the Museum of Science for putting together this event, and welcome to all of you. Thank you for spending your evening with us. We're going to talk about the brain and its many glorious features, but as you just heard, there's been a lot said about the brain, and Aristotle was not shy to talk about it. He realized, as many of us do from our life and life experiences, that the brain is plastic and that it responds to experience in interesting ways, and perhaps as a result allows us to acquire amazing skills and abilities. But at the same time, it makes us vulnerable to early life experiences in particular, and you see here his thoughts on the importance of childhood. If this is true, then one would also have to worry about what we provide to these children. Are we really doing the right thing? And what are the implications of early life experience for their future? Based on our experience, we do our best, but how is the child's brain responding to this sort of input? What we're talking about here is the brain's ability to adapt or be plastic. And for many decades, we've talked about genes and environment, the nature-nurture question. And we'll touch on both in this session this evening, how these factors will influence brain function. Our work in particular is focused on this point of intersection, how the brain, which has been beautifully formed early in embryonic life, arrives into the world and is then shaped by the culture, the environment into which the infant is born. And often there are windows of time when these experiences are particularly potent in shaping brain function, and they're often referred to as critical or sensitive periods. And these are essentially exaggerated moments of brain plasticity. And so it's a nice setting to try and understand how the brain responds to experience. First, I'd like to tell you that there are, of course, multiple such windows in brain development, and that they seem to have a hierarchical nature and perhaps finite durations. And so in the neurobiological study of brain plasticity, we're interested in understanding the timing mechanisms, what turns them on at different times, what determines their duration, and ultimately what might shut them off if they ever do shut off. And so I teach a course on this at Harvard, and usually I have a semester to go through this. Tonight we have 20 minutes. So let's start with definitions. What is brain plasticity? Well, probably all of you would agree it means something like this. It's the ability to alter brain function in response to experience. And so what we'd like to do is to dig into this a little bit and understand what's going on in neurobiological terms. So in order to do that, we need to know how does the brain work. Anybody? How does the brain work? No one. Well, fortunately, we have very clever colleagues at Harvard, and when Steven Pinker was asked this question by Stephen Colbert, how does the brain work? in 5 words or less, he said, brain cells fire in patterns. It's not bad. So in fact, brain cells do fire in patterns, and it's this day-to-day, moment-by-moment activity of neurons which underlies neural function, brain function. But this doesn't actually capture the notion of brain plasticity. How is it that these connections might change? And so there are equally pithy phrases in our field which capture this notion. What if neurons that are repeatedly co-activated fire together, then those connections would strengthen. This was a concept introduced by Donald Hebb in 1949. And of course, many scientists have followed this up experimentally. And so the patterns of activity not only process information, but may allow the nervous system to change. But if you think about this for a moment, if all neurons that fire together are wired together, eventually all our neurons may be wired together. And so initially on theoretical grounds, and then on experimental evidence, complementary rules were introduced. It's not quite 5 words, I guess, but out of sync, lose a link. And so these are the kinds of notions that are driving a lot of the developmental research and learning and memory type studies. And so if we translate this rather general statement about brain plasticity into more cellular and molecular terms, we could say that the ability is represented by a host of molecules that are being discovered every day that might allow this adjustment of brain function. When we talk about brain function, we need to be more specific and identify which circuit we're talking about. And experience, as far as the brain is concerned, as Pinker captured here, is patterns of neural activity. And so when we, as neuroscientists, talk about brain plasticity, we're thinking in these terms. What are the molecules in which brain circuits that are adjusting connectivity as a result of activity patterns? So let's take 2 examples. The visual system has been a workhorse model of this sort of plasticity and is relatively well understood. It has 2 inputs, right eye and left eye. And there's a complex pathway that processes this visual information. It turns out that its function, vision, it has many, many aspects, but visual acuity, the ability to resolve visual inputs at particular distances, can be already detected here in primary visual cortex as a function of the interaction of right eye and left eye. And so many of you are perhaps familiar with the condition known as lazy eye or amblyopia, which is an enduring loss of visual acuity because of some early discordant visual input. A deviant eye or an occluded eye is at some kind of disadvantage, it turns out, early in life because of these plasticity rules. And so the open eye or the more salient eye input tends to get strengthened in the visual cortex, and connections from the deviant eye tend to weaken. And so amblyopia, although a visual impairment, is actually a problem of wiring in the brain. It turns out that there is an ever-declining brain plasticity that over the first 8 or 9 years allows one to correct the visual input and rescue this connectivity. But after the age of 8 or 9, there is currently no cure for amblyopia. And so these subjects will continue to have the inability to see in depth in 3D. What happens in the brain? Well, pioneers in this field, David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel, many of their scientific progeny have followed up in animal models and found that, in fact, it's a competitive plasticity. If you look at the input from one or the other eye, for example, anatomically by injecting a tracer, you would find that in a normally forward-viewing mammal like ourselves or monkeys or cats, the left eye and right eye input arrives into the visual cortex in a nice balanced fashion, interdigitating right eye and left eye targets. And so you see here labeled and unlabeled visual inputs. Below is the consequence of patching an eye or creating a model of this amblyopia and then injecting a tracer into the good eye. And what you see is this dramatic rewiring of the brain. that open eye input has largely taken over the visual cortex at the expense of closed eye input. And so there is this competitive plasticity. This is a case of deprivation. What about a case of enrichment or exposure? The auditory system is a great example of this. If you were to raise a mouse, for example, listening to normal tones in a cage, its auditory system would develop in a way to represent sound frequency in a nice, orderly map. And so what you're looking at here is the surface of the auditory cortex, and the color represents the best sound frequency over here and right that activates neurons in that part of the brain. And so from the back to the front of the auditory cortex, you see that there is a nice tonotopic map from low to high frequency sounds represented. On the right is the brother of this mouse, who was plucked out and raised for just a few days listening to a particular sound frequency, 7 kilohertz in lime green, repeatedly during what turns out to be an auditory critical period, and then returned to the normal environment. And as adults, you see that this mouse has a larger representation of that overrepresented sound at the expense of neighboring frequencies. So, although coming from the same litter, this mouse will forever hear the world differently than this one because of this early life experience. It turns out it's just a 3-day critical period to cause this enduring shift in the map. So, does this sound familiar? Well, humans arrive into the world, and they're showered with sound, usually their native language, or maybe multiple native languages, and the same sort of process takes place. And so psychologists have identified for several years now a process of developmental pruning, or perceptual narrowing, in the ability to hear speech sounds. Infants born around the world are able to hear the speech sounds of any language, it turns out. But through just a few months of early life exposure repeatedly to one native language, they lose the ability to hear non-native speech sounds. And so there is a sort of critical period effect, very similar to what we're describing here in these animal models. But this is just the beginning. This is the ability to discriminate two sounds, R from L, for example, which is easy for us to do in English-speaking countries, but a nightmare for Japanese speakers. And this is because they've lost this ability. That segues into other language-related abilities, such as matching the sound of a speaker's voice to the facial expression and pairing the speech sound with the visual input, all the way up to the ability to process native versus non-native sounds and language as we consider it in higher order areas. So for example, subjects who are raised in a multilingual environment from birth would treat both languages similarly in higher order language areas, activating overlapping regions of cortex, as compared to those people who acquired a second language after the age of 11, where the second language does not co-activate the same area as the native language that was acquired from birth. And so there's evidence accumulating, even in humans, that there are these sorts of windows and milestones when brain plasticity can shape neural circuitry. And in the end, in an accumulation of multiple such windows, we have very complex behaviors like language. This sort of information, of course, is quite useful if you consider, for example, second language learning. It is quite unusual knowing that at the age of 11, there is a sort of discrimination between those who can speak multiple languages and process them differently from those who acquire it later. Especially in our country here, second language learning is introduced quite late, surprisingly from a neurobiological perspective, when perhaps this critical period is already over. In the neuroscience of critical periods, we then dig into the neuron types in the brain that might underlie this kind of plasticity. All neurons here are found in the cerebral cortex, And what you find is that the majority of those neurons are excitatory, meaning they release a neurotransmitter glutamate that acts on receptors on target cells to cause the cells to fire more. They're surrounded by a minority population of inhibitory cells, which release a different chemical, GABA, which in fact dampens the ability of target cells to fire. In this excitatory-inhibitory balance, it's becoming clear that it's this minority population which is directing traffic, and that perhaps even amongst these, one subtype of inhibitory cell might be maturing in register with these critical periods. And so several lines of evidence suggest that if you manipulate the development of this inhibitory population, you can delay this window of plasticity, or you can accelerate it. And there are ways, multiple ways, in which this could be manipulated. So in the case of the visual system, raising animals in total darkness causes these cells to delay development, and in fact delays this critical period of plasticity. Conversely, if you give a drug that enhances inhibitory transmission, drugs like Valium, for example, given to young animals will trigger a premature critical period. There are many details here that I've omitted, but in fact, the concept is that these critical periods themselves are plastic. The window is not set in stone. It's biologically determined. And in fact, there are so many ways in which this excitatory-inhibitory balance could be impacted. Pharmacologically, like I mentioned, by benzodiazepines, for example. Environmentally, as I'll mention in a second. Or genetically, many genes that are linked to neurodevelopmental disorders, in fact, are ultimately affecting this excitatory-inhibitory balance. And so this adds a very difficult wrinkle to understanding brain plasticity. At any given moment, the brain's plastic state could be before, during, or after such a window, reflecting the multiple factors which affect this balance. One topic that will come up later tonight is the effects of early life stress. Early life stress impacts the maturation of stress circuits, including the hippocampus, amygdala, and prefrontal cortex. And just like primary sensory areas, it's becoming clear that early life experience can shift the time windows of maturation of these circuits which underlie such complex phenomena like post-traumatic stress disorder. Now you might be wondering, if we can understand what turns on these windows of plasticity and move them around, can we also understand what turns them off? Is it possible then to understand this system well enough to maybe do this? Create a second critical period when we need it. This sounds rather attractive. If you want to learn a new language, why not try and reopen a critical period? Well, in fact, it's becoming clear that the brain does go through these windows for biological reasons. Traditionally, the view has been that the young brain will, in fact, be full of plasticity factors, many of those molecules I mentioned, and that they disappear with age, making it harder for us to learn that second or third language. But equally important, it seems, is the brain's desire to become stable. And so as the brain matures, it also expresses new molecules which dampen excess wiring. These are brake-like factors. One example is seen on these very same GABA neurons that I mentioned. As these cells get older, they wrap themselves up in a funny little structure called the perineuronal net. And it's a marker of mature brain circuitry. You can, in fact, go into the mature brain and manipulate and dissolve these net-like structures and make an adult visual cortex, for example, young again, plastic again, and recover their ability to see, even if they've been raised in an amblyopic condition. That's all well and good, but it's highly invasive, and so I wouldn't recommend doing that necessarily. It's a proof of concept, but the idea is that the brain is putting on molecules to stabilize plasticity, and this is what's contributing to this notion of closing a critical period. There are many molecules being discovered which take this excitatory-inhibitory balance, which enables circuit rewiring, and then ultimately prevents circuit rewiring. Perineuronal nets are just one of them. Myelin, you're familiar with, is full of molecules that are preventing sprouting of connections and rewiring of circuits. Epigenetic factors contribute to the closure of gene programs that allow rewiring of circuits. And so in an experimental setting, we can go in and remove these things and show that the brain, in fact, retains a plastic ability, but it's being shut down. There are also interesting other factors, thank goodness, which modulate this excitatory-inhibitory balance in perhaps more approachable therapeutic ways, and they involve putting brakes on neuromodulators. This allows us to do something that had not been possible before. We can give human subjects drugs like HDAC inhibitors and allow them to acquire skills that were normally acquired only in the first 6 or 7 years of life. And this is, I think, going to become a very interesting area of research. Can we give back this ability to rewire circuitry in the adult brain, knowing that they have not lost the ability to rewire, they are simply masking it or dampening it with these brakes? Many people are interested in this, as you can imagine. But we're interested in the therapeutic implications. And so, in fact, can we rescue amblyopia and restore vision to people who need this kind of plasticity later in life? And you can think of many other uses, I'm sure, and we'll hear about it in the question session. So this is where I'll leave you. We've been trying to understand brain plasticity as something that changes over the life course. And for some reason, it's very prevalent and obvious early in life. And that perhaps by understanding it at a biological level, we may be able to rekindle that or something like that in older subjects when it's really needed. But even having that ability is just an opportunity. Training and hard work is still necessary to rewire circuitry. And there's no doubt that early in life, the natural time when the brain is plastic is the best time. If you can do the right thing early, then you can set up these circuits properly. After all, if they've been pruned by early life experience, exactly how much of it can we recapture later in life, even if we were given some miracle drug? And this is exactly what we're interested in understanding, especially from the point of view of healthy brain development. And that's what the Conti Center at Harvard University is focused on, a number of laboratories there trying to understand what controls brain plasticity, especially through this hub-like GABAergic neuron. So I'll leave you here, and thank you for your attention.
Okay. Well, I also want to add my thanks to the museum for putting on this evening. It's wonderful to be a part of this, and to all of you for being here. I'm going to try to spend the next few minutes giving you a flavor of this incredible dialogue between nature and nurture and what it means for how our mental lives play out, how it impacts mental health and mental illness. And let me start by making this point. Most of you have, or at some point in your lives will, experience a major traumatic event. Things like losing a parent, or being in an accident, or being the victim of an assault. These are things that sometimes can leave lasting scars, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later this evening. And yet about 1 in 10 people develop a condition like post-traumatic stress disorder. You could think that was maybe a high number or a low number, but it raises this question about why is that? What are the reasons for these tremendous differences in the trajectories that our lives take? What makes some of us more vulnerable than others? And my work has focused on the role of genes and experience in mental illness and what drives that for me is the tremendous suffering and toll that these conditions take. And you may or may not know that neuropsychiatric disorders, which you can see in this slide over here, are actually the leading cause of disability worldwide. And actually, if you break it down by disorder, depression leads the list. And this is more than cancer and heart disease put together. They can also have fatal consequences. So we know that suicide is the fourth leading cause of death. And people with major mental illness actually have a substantially shorter lifespan. So these are major public health conditions and cause a tremendous personal toll for individuals and families. And if we're going to really understand how to approach them, how to develop ways of preventing or perhaps treating these disorders, we have to start with an understanding of how they arise. What are they about? How does the brain develop? How do our minds develop in ways that shift us in one direction or another? Now, if you asked psychiatrists 50 years ago, they could probably give you a pretty easy answer. And the answer to what was the cause of most mental illness was basically, it was laid at the feet of one person, and that was the mother. And these are quotes which actually are difficult to read now because they're so shocking, but these were mainstream views. So there was the concept of the refrigerator mother. Bruno Bedelheim, very famous child psychologist, said the precipitating factor in infantile autism is the parent's wish that his child should not exist. Or John Rosen, who was a British psychoanalyst, who said that schizophrenia is caused by the mother's inability to love her child. These were views that were incredibly painful and created a tremendous burden for families. And in many ways, it was advances in our understanding of the biology and genetics contributing to some of these disorders that overturned some of these views. We now know that genetic and family factors contribute to really all psychiatric disorders that have been studied. What you're looking at on this slide is a list of several disorders and the familial relative risk, which is essentially how much more likely are you to suffer from the disorder if you are the first-degree relative, let's say a sibling or a child of somebody with the condition, compared to if we pulled you at random from the population. So for schizophrenia, that's about tenfold more likely. And then the heritability, and I promise you this is the only slide that has lots of numbers on it, but the heritability has to do with how influential are genetic differences among people in determining who becomes ill in the population. So that could range from 0 to 100%. And what's striking is that for all of these disorders, it's substantial. And I've put breast cancer at the bottom here for comparison, because there's a condition that we think of as having a pretty strong genetic component, and does. But you can see that the heritability of many of these disorders are substantially higher. Now, actually finding some of the genes that may be involved really is a very recent phenomenon, and it depended on some major breakthroughs in our understanding of the genome. And this dates back, this is a 21st century thing. So it was only in 2001 that the human genome sequence, the first human genome sequence was released, essentially. And then there have been a number of big science projects which have cataloged genetic variation around the world, begun to unravel what is it that these genetic variations are actually doing, and created tools that have allowed us to study the genetics of many conditions in ways that really are unprecedented or were until recently. And so you've now seen, probably in the press, many reports about genes being identified that relate to a whole variety of disorders. And that is pretty exciting, and it's an exciting time to be doing this research. Sometimes the hype gets a little bit ahead of the science, and you may, if you read the popular press, think that we're on the verge of identifying the gene for practically everything. This is my favorite example. You know when you're on the phone with somebody and they say, I'll let you go now, like they're trying to do you some kind of favor, but it's really them that wants to get off the phone and they just don't want to admit it? I think I've isolated the gene for that. That is not where we are. That's at least 5 years away. But But there has actually been a kind of quiet revolution in our understanding of the genetics of psychiatric disorders and neuropsychiatric disorders. So before 2008, if you asked people in this field, tell me some genetic variation that you know is related to a psychiatric condition, the answer would be, well, there wouldn't be much of an answer. But just in the last 5 years or so, that has really changed. So what you see here is the number of variants that have been identified with a degree of evidence that people in the field really accept as a real finding. And it's gone from almost nothing to about 200 in just the space of a few years. It's still a small component of the overall genetic part of these conditions, but it is quite an advance. Another thing that has been emerging that is fascinating to me and to many people is the fact that these genetic variations that we're identifying don't necessarily map on to the clinical conditions that we recognize. For example, in psychiatry's DSM manual of diagnosis. DNA hasn't apparently read that manual. And if you tried to actually draw the DSM based on what family and twin studies suggest or the relationships among these things, you'd get something that looked kind of like that. So there aren't, sharp lines between these disorders. Now that we're in this age where we can do these very large-scale genetic studies, we can actually ask the question, how does that play out at the level of DNA, of molecular genetics? Can we find variants that contribute to more than one of these disorders? And actually, just this past year, in what was the largest genome-wide study of psychiatric disorders, my colleagues and I in the International Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, which is a group of scientists around the world, were able to put together data for 5 very different psychiatric disorders: ADHD, autism, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression. This is a sample of more than 60,000, and identify variants that seem to have an effect on all 5 of those conditions. One of the interesting things was that they seem to cluster among genes, or at least some of them seem to cluster among genes related to something called calcium channel signaling. And calcium channels are proteins in the brain that are very important in how synapses function, how nerve cells communicate. We also found that if you look kind of just at the aggregate of the genome and look at how much of the genetic variation for one disorder is correlated with the genetic variation or overlaps for another disorder, they were pretty substantial. So a correlation of about 0.68, or you could think of it as 68%, for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. That's actually a big surprise in psychiatry, this kind of overlap, because many of these conditions are thought of as very different. In fact, some of them are mutually exclusive. You can't have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. So this is an interesting theme that's emerging. But part of this is saying that, again, the DSM and the DNA don't necessarily match up. There aren't no bright lines between many of these disorders, or for that matter, between normal and abnormal. And that kind of realization has led our group and others to begin to look at some of the more fundamental building blocks of how the mind develops. And one area that we've been interested in, as have many, is the idea of temperament, childhood temperament. So, we all start life with certain biases in how we approach the world. And these are things that are evident in the first few months of life. So for example, some kids tend to be highly reactive to novel situations, to unfamiliar things, and somewhat wary of them. So if you, for example, dangle a mobile in front of a 4-month-old, some of them will tense up or arch their back. Others will be completely imperturbable, and most kids are sort of somewhere in between. But it turns out that, for example, that profile of high reactivity tends to be correlated with a kind of shyness in childhood and an increased risk for social anxiety problems and other anxiety problems later in life. It tends to be somewhat stable. And in fact, what's interesting is it's heritable, these profiles. And in work done by my colleague Carl Schwartz at Mass General, if you take kids who came into the laboratory in the second year of life and were observed in their behavior and shown to be either inhibited or uninhibited, bring them back 20 years later and have them undergo brain imaging, you can actually see this sort of footprint of temperament. So the kids who were inhibited or highly reactive as early as 4 months of age have a more reactive amygdala, this emotion center in the brain, thinning of parts of the prefrontal cortex that are involved in responding to novelty and emotional situations. And we know that genes are involved in these kinds of differences. One way is because twin studies have shown that they're heritable. But another, some of the most dramatic, come from studies of conditions where specific genes are affected or go missing, and the effect has a big impact on temperament, on sociability, on approach to life. So that's a pretty dramatic example, but our group and others have found that there are specific genetic variants that seem to affect more common forms of temperament in kids. In this case, it was a gene that also seemed to influence adult personality, introversion, and the reactivity of some of these elements of the brain that are involved in processing emotion. We've now begun to do this on a larger scale in a project at Mass General called the Brain Genomic Superstruct Project with Randy Buckner at Harvard University and Mass General. We're looking at, we now have a study of about 4,000 folks who have undergone brain imaging and DNA collection, and we're beginning to sort of look at the neural and genetic basis of some of these differences and how we approach life, how we process emotions. In one of the first studies of this in a group of over 1,000 individuals, we were able to identify a kind of brain signature for how we react to the world in terms of negative emotionality. Some people tend to have a kind of anxiety proneness or tendency to experience negative emotions. What we found was that this was associated, and this is a healthy sample of individuals, not with disorders, associated with a larger amygdala and thinning of a part of the prefrontal cortex that's been implicated in kind of regulating how the amygdala works. It was also associated with social impairment, detachment, avoidance. And then we were able to take data from very large-scale genetic studies where we had a genetic risk score for depression and found, interestingly, that genetic loading for depression was also associated with this thinning. So it's this kind of example of how some of the genetic basis and brain basis of variation in personality and temperament shades into risk for disorder. Again, how there aren't these bright lines. Now, as Takao was talking about, and we know, genes are not destiny. We enter life with kind of a basic book compiled by evolution, our genome, and then some tweaks in terms of individual genetic variation that point us in slightly different directions. But there's two problems that evolution has had to face, or two things we've had to confront. One is that we have a finite genome and we have an ever-changing world. So we would be up a creek if we had to program everything in our genes, right? Because the first time that something unexpected happened in the environment, we wouldn't be able to adapt. And so the brilliance of nature and the way the brain has been formed is to encode, instead of all the if-then possibilities of life, this capacity for plasticity. And Takao beautifully, I think, gave you an introduction to how that works. One of the most remarkable features of brain development is that we use the world to wire our brains. That early in life, we extract and tune into the most important information we need to wire up these systems that will allow us to navigate life. And in some ways, as we pass through these sensitive period windows, those can have long-lasting effects. So essentially, the infant and the child are kind of, their brain is sort of placing bets on what the world is going to be like based on what it's been like so far. And if the world you are in is nurturing and consistent, that may set a trajectory for mental health. If it's harsh and threatening and inconsistent, that may set another trajectory. And we can see how this can actually shape the way we interact with each other. So here's an example from the work of Seth Pollack, looking at kids who had been abused, maltreated in early childhood compared to control kids. These are not the kids. What happened was they were shown faces that morphed from one facial expression to another. So an angry face morphing into a sad face, and so on. What he noticed in this and other studies is that the kids who had been abused early in life had become experts in anger. Their brains were tuned to detect anger with a degree of sensitivity that most of us, or most people who hadn't been abused, couldn't. So for example, as the angry face was morphing towards sad, the control kids stopped seeing anger in the face about here, whereas the kids who had been abused kept seeing it till here. And there are other experiments like this. What it suggests is that, again, as they passed through these developmental windows, they adapted to what the world seemed to be like and developed skills, in this case, that might have meant the difference between having enough time to get away from somebody who was about to hit you or not. It's a sort of a sad expertise that they developed. Now, we know also that even if we can't open up critical periods, as Takao was saying, and he suggested that we might be able to, but we also know that the brain changes throughout life and is plastic throughout life. We learn things. And some of you may know this example of how, for example, in spatial knowledge and other kinds of expertise, we can begin to see changes in the brain for things that we learn later in life. So here's the case of London cabbies, who you may know have to spend 2 to 4 years acquiring what they call the knowledge, which is essentially a map in their brains of the 25,000 streets of London. And what's interesting is not only by the end of that do they get a great sense for the streets of London, but they actually have detectable changes in the brain that correlate with how much expertise they have in this. Expansion of areas of the brain that are devoted to spatial memory. And these kinds of things have now been seen in other scenarios where we acquire expertise. So experience matters throughout the life course, and we know that genes are not destiny. One thing that sort of tells us that and makes it sort of self-evident is, what about identical twins? They're very similar, but they're not identical, right? Or here's a question that you've probably asked yourself. Why doesn't your liver have teeth? Every cell in your body has the same genome, right? So if it's in the genes, how is it that your teeth know not to grow in your liver? There must be something that controls when these things go on and off. And it turns out that gene expression is the answer to a lot of what happens to us in life, how the instructions get read out and where. It's sort of, the genome is kind of this strange version of Hollywood. If you think of the genes that make proteins as actors, most of the genome is actually directors. It's mostly things that are telling the genes when and where to turn on and off. And one of the players in this is this parallel code, the epigenome. So instead of simply the DNA sequence, we have all this annotation on top of it, either marks to the DNA itself or to the proteins that the DNA is wrapped around that determine how and when genes turn on and off. And this is sort of chemically marking up our genes in ways that direct how the genes function. And we see this being affected by all kinds of things. And I'll just mention briefly, many of you may know the work of Michael Meany, which has suggested that the way that maternal care happens early in the life of a rat pup has long-lasting programming effects on the stress response system and behavior of that animal. So some rat moms are, to anthropomorphize, very nurturing. They lick and groom their pups frequently. They make it easy for them to nurse, and others are not. And in the first week of life, that difference in behavior seems to determine whether an epigenetic cap stays on a gene that's involved in coordinating our stress hormone system. And if that cap is on, it begins a trajectory of dysregulation of the stress hormone system and behavioral changes as well that seem to last a long time. We're in the very early stages of understanding the epigenome. There have been some human studies that have suggested that, for example, that same mark has been found on a stress hormone gene has been found in the offspring of depressed moms or in suicide victims who have been maltreated in childhood. But it raises this interesting notion that in the nuclear core of our cells, nurture is nature at some level. I'm going to end by asking the question that you may be asking is, so what does this all mean, and how could this play out into something that that can be useful for, say, preventing or treating disorder or helping. I'll give you just two quick examples. One is that we may learn things from genetic studies, for example, that point us in new directions for developing treatments. That's a big hope. And you may know that all of the psychiatric medications that we have are based on biological insights that are 40 years old or more. There has really been very little fundamentally new. The genetic findings are now pointing to molecules and pathways that are new targets for developing treatment, things that we really hadn't anticipated before, and they're beginning to sketch out a story about the biology of these disorders. Another example is that we may be able to harness plasticity in the biology of this to relieve suffering itself. So an example there would be anxiety and fear. And of course, we know a lot about the circuitry involved in fear and anxiety and response to trauma even. We even know something about, or quite a bit actually, about the synaptic level, the neurons that are necessary for laying down emotional memories and what some of the neurotransmitters involved are. And that kind of knowledge led a group of researchers a few years ago to suggest something very interesting. So if we think of anxiety disorders as our sort of fear circuitry gone awry, the most effective treatment, or one of the most effective treatments for a whole range of anxiety disorders, is something called cognitive behavioral therapy, which in a sense is using plasticity. It's using ways of forming new emotional memories that can extinguish old memories or associations of fear or trauma. And this process of fear extinction is itself a learning process. You're laying down a new memory. Well, some researchers realized that one of the key elements in laying down those emotional memories is a neurotransmitter called glutamate that acts in the amygdala and other areas in the emotion circuitry. And it has a cofactor called glycine, or sometimes D-serine is involved. And they suggested, there's a drug that actually mimics D-serine. It's an antibiotic used to treat tuberculosis called D-cycloserine. And they wondered whether using that in conjunction with cognitive behavioral therapy might accelerate or enhance this emotional learning that is a part of therapy. And in fact, there have now been a number of studies suggesting that taking this pill, say a half hour or an hour ahead of your cognitive behavioral therapy session, can accelerate or boost the effects of cognitive behavioral therapy for panic disorder and social phobia and perhaps PTSD as well. So I'm going to end there. Hopefully I've given you a sense, or at least a taste, of this fascinating dialogue that we're all sort of consumed by and wanting to understand this dialogue between nature and nurture. This is a very exciting time to be doing research in this area because of the tools and this growing body of knowledge we have. And so I'm going to stop there and thank you all for your attention as well. Justine.
It's lovely to be here and to see you all, because in the way that I work, one of the greatest problems is the stigma. And to have a room full of people who've come to learn about the healthy brain is very inspirational. A healthy brain, it's a slightly nebulous idea. We have some clearer ideas about it because of what Takao and Jordan have been telling us. But we don't have the same sensibility, in my experience, of a healthy brain as we do a healthy body. We're so wired now to an idea of what a healthy body means. But the healthy brain is something that I think most of us still see an image of a brain in our mind. Hippocrates, we've had lots of quotes this evening from all sorts of people, and quite a few of them are Greeks, going back a really long time. Hippocrates, and much of what Hippocrates taught or opened up has been disproven by medical science. But there are some central tenets that still mean that he is called the father of modern Western medicine. One of them was separating this idea that our physical health was in the hands of the gods. The second, which for the purpose of this evening to me is infinitely more interesting is that the mind and the body are inextricably linked. We cannot treat one without treating the other. Moving out of extraordinarily state-of-the-art neuroscientific laboratory of Takao and Jordan's world, I'm now taking you on a camping trip. We have about 2 sticks in our backpack and a can, and we have no can opener. I'm in development work, and I'm working in a place where I'm not going to go into too much about it. I'm going to show you some images to give you a sense of the place. But we are, okay, so if they are the Pentagon, we are the Marines, we're improvising, we're in the field, and we're trying to use whatever is available to us. We're using a whole range of things, my team and myself, to treat people who've been living through a very extended conflict. There are now 3 generations of people who've been psychologically damaged by over 25 years of war and violence. And in our backpack, our sticks and our non-can opener and can, we are using everything ranging from cognitive behavior therapy through various, let us say, more state-of-the-art things to which they're all familiar to you. But my experience is showing me that we are ignoring some of the most profoundly important things. And there's sort of an arrogance about it. The 5 pillars of mental health: good sleep, good nutrition and hydration, an understanding of how important routine is to us, and that a vitally important part of that is exercise. We weren't designed to sit down for long periods of time. My personal experience of having lived through a long war and my own psychological damage as a result of it is that for me, to not exercise is the equivalent of taking a depressant. And the last one, which is possibly one of the most whimsically misunderstood, is mindfulness, but I'm going to come back to that. So I think at this point, rather than giving history lessons and this and that about where I work, I will present you with a visual of the paradox of the Kashmir Valley, which lies between Pakistan and India. It is arguably the reason why these 2 nations put themselves in a nuclear-armed race against each other. They fought 3 wars over it, and it is also, it's a cupping bowl of much of the jihadi problems that we have, or we are exposed to now in the world. So, Carl, if I may, could we have the movie?
उठ फरीदा सुतिया झाड़ू दे मसीत तू सुता रब जागदा तेरी डाडे नाल प्रीत फकीरा फकीरी दूर है पीरा फकीरी दूर है जितनी के लम्मी खजूर है चढ़ जाए तो चुप चकना चूर है पावेगा दीदार सहबदा.
As I said, we are using what is available to us. We are improvising all the time. So I want to take some case studies from my experience and my work there, but also from other places, just to illustrate some of the things that Takao and Jordan were talking about. The people I'm talking about are very glad to share their story, and to the extent they didn't even want me to change their names. Shabir is a young man who's now 29 years old, and at the age of 6, his father was disappeared. In the context of Kashmir, this means that in the middle of the night, in his neighborhood, a downtown neighborhood in the Kashmir Valley, the security forces smashed down the door of the family home, and his father was taken away, disappeared because his father never reappeared. He might have died during interrogation. He may be in a prison somewhere in India. But this has happened to thousands of families across Kashmir. So the women folk of these families are left with no bodies to mourn. A whole pathology has been created. Well, young Shabir, age 6, seemed to be fine. But as he approached puberty, his behavior became increasingly disruptive at school, to the extent that in the quite poor neighborhood where he was living with his family, the school had no choice but to throw him out. And because the family were poor, there was nowhere else to send him. Once he was back home, he was increasingly disruptive and indeed violent at home, and he was beginning to show increasingly obsessive, compulsive symptoms. When he actually hit puberty, he started to bedwet. And when he started to bedwet, his behavior became even more violent. This is when the family managed to get beyond their shame, because the stigma is huge, and began to take Shabir to doctors. The response was to medicate him very heavily. He was medicated from the age of 14 through until he came to see us, medicated to a state where he was not really functioning. He was never able to get a job or to pursue any kind of education. Now, Shabir was a difficult customer, let us say, because when he was sitting in the sessions, when we were trying to, let us say, psychoeducate him, help him to understand his story, to re-empower him so that to take some of the power away from the medication and to give this young man a chance to take responsibility for himself, he was receptive to the point where his physical restlessness would stop him. It was as if he would go deaf. He couldn't hear anymore. So I came up with the idea of walking. Our sessions began to be walking therapy. And something almost, well, in a place like Kashmir, I could say magical, something to do with the rhythm of left, right, his breath connecting with the movement, allowed him to access aspects of his mind and his understanding. And the psychotherapeutic education of Shabir began to move very rapidly as long as we were walking. Shabir now lives by a very strong routine. He absolutely understands that without routine, he is not able to function, but he is functioning now. He has part-time work, and he's reintegrated in with his family, which has caused enormous celebration. He walks every single day of his life, regardless of the weather, for a minimum of 1 hour. He knows that if he doesn't walk, he has a big setback. So at the age of 29, a certain form of plasticity was possible. What had been shut down during a period of his life seems to be opening up again. Another example I'd like to take is across two very different regions. Ellie is a young woman of 21, and Shakil is a young man of 21. Ellie is a young woman who's based at a very good school in London. She had been an A-grade student all the way through. And when she did the exams before her final exams, for the first time in her life, in her education life, she didn't do well. It triggered an unprecedented depression in her, to the extent that she made a very serious attempt on her life, ended up in a clinic, and came to work with me after she came out of the clinic. I use the same methods with Ellie as we use with people in Kashmir. We worked on these 5 pillars of mental health. We worked using cognitive behavior therapy. And whilst Ellie made some recovery and continues to make some recovery, she is struggling and she's having relapses. Shakil is a young man from a not dissimilar poor neighborhood in downtown Srinagar, and he comes from a very large extended family. In Kashmir, most people live in very extended families. Shakil's family had had a bad war. 2 of his uncles were killed in front of the family. One uncle had his throat slit by a militant group who burst in. Another uncle was beaten to death, well, actually till the point where he had a heart attack, so obviously he died in front of the family again. 2 cousin brothers, as they're called, first cousins who they all regard as brothers, were disappeared, and they have no one has any idea where they are. Shakil was doing equally as well as Ellie through his academic career, A-grade student all the way through. As he approached his final exams, he began to experience symptoms of anxiety that started off with what we call a general anxiety disorder, but became increasingly bad to the extent that he could no longer concentrate on studying. And the more he was unable to study, the more the anxiety grew until it became what we call a major anxiety disorder. Now, worked with him in exactly the same way as Ellie. 5 pillars of mental health, cognitive behavior therapy, a few other things which I would say were of a more spiritual nature, but I will come back to this point of mindfulness. Carl, are you okay? It sounds a bit feedbacky. Should I move back? Are you okay? So Shakil made very rapid recovery. Once he began to understand what was going on, he not only was, let us say, stabilized, he was so enthusiastic about his own recovery. He became quite zealous. He's become one of our poster children. He very rapidly was able to go back into study, mainly by understanding that this very earnest young man whose whole life was about study, his main breakthrough was understanding the importance of ritualized recovery. That to study all the time diluted the effect of the study. That if he could have periods where he stopped studying and genuinely took rest, he would do better. Shakil was able to go back, he was able to take his exams. Now, the thing for him, the hope that he had clung through to all through his childhood was if he did well enough in exams, from the support of his family, he would be able to springboard himself out of the state. He would be able to escape using his academic achievements. Slight paradox. The nurturing nature of this loving family that had been through hell enabled him to make, it would seem, a more full recovery. Ellie, by contrast, on paper, her lifestyle looks good. She comes from a very privileged background, but her parents divorced at a particularly vulnerable time for her, and she consistently reports that she feels emotional aridity in her life. She has no sense, she says, my sense of love is conceptual. She is struggling, she continues to struggle, and she's really stuck with this idea that unless she has some kind of emotional nurturing, she's not going to make it. And because for her, her hope was, her synaptic trigger in a way, if she could compete with herself all the time and keep outperforming herself, she would make progress in life. But when she hit that wall of her first failure, her psyche seemed to crumble, and she still continues to struggle. So going back to these things, and forgive me if it sounds as if I'm going on too long about this idea of these very, very basic elements. I go on about them because it's almost as if we've become too arrogant. We ignore them at our peril. So this idea of good sleep, these are all the things that we throw out first of all. When we are anxious, when we are under stress, these tend to be the things that we throw away immediately. We don't sleep as much, we don't eat properly, we abandon routines, we chuck exercise off the list very early on, and mindfulness it's got a bit of a flaky connotation for some people now, I think. Mindfulness, in my understanding, I would say saved my life, and I'm not being a drama queen. I had very extreme post-traumatic stress disorder, and by being able to train my mind to focus on a single thing, to be able to draw myself back from the constant mental torture and focus on a single thing, I believe saved my life. We are much more resilient than we believe. The Western society, the first world, developed world, the free world, whatever we want to call it, we have many arrogances. One of them is this idea that somehow we know better. We are constantly distracting ourselves from what is fundamentally important. There is a very good reason why soldiers, when they come back from war, veterans, aid workers who come back from frontline areas, whether natural disaster or warfare, NGO workers, frontline journalists, they have a very difficult time adapting. There are all sorts of explanations given for this. My experience, our experience from the work we're doing is, why do the people of Kashmir that we are treating respond so very readily to being given a routine, to having structures to work with? They are continually, every day of their lives, faced with the very strong reality of death. They are very connected to what it means to be alive. A soldier will tell you that they never felt so alive as when they were in the front line of war. And yet, we are all the time divorcing ourselves from this sense of aliveness. The things that, in this rather broad spectrum of mindfulness, this thing that allows us to exercise the muscle of our mind to keep this mind, this brain healthy, we are constantly distracting ourselves. Every time we think we're in a situation where we're about to relax with our family, with the things that are sources of happiness, instead of focusing on that moment, we look at our iPhone, we look at our iPad, we wander off in our mind somewhere else. The power of singular focus on one thing is profound. And it starts in the most simple way. Reconnecting with the importance, this sense of being alive, starts with paying attention to a single breath. If you simply are aware of your inhalation and your exhalation, you are absolutely present. 20,000 times a day, roughly, you have that opportunity to be absolutely present in the moment, totally engaged with your aliveness. I think it is one of the most powerful things we have in keeping our minds, our brains healthy. So if there are 1,000 things you take from tonight, or if there are 2 things, or if there's 1 thing, please reinvent your idea of what mindfulness means, what your sense of being alive means, and reconnect that with this idea that the mind and the body are inextricably linked. Your next breath connects you absolutely to your mind and your body at the same time. Thank you so much, everybody. And now I invite Takao and Jordan back to chat.
I know my first question is to both of you. Out of this neuroscientific lab of extraordinary information you've given us, what is one thing that we could actually apply to the quotidian aspect of mental health as a public health issue? If you could, Takao, may I start with you? If you could take one thing from what you're learning, everything that you're developing at the moment, how could that immediately, right now, be applied to this major public health issue of mental health?
Well, I think your quoting Hippocrates was very appropriate. It's in our power. The brain biology is something that we have to dig deep. I don't know if any of you have read Steve Jobs' book, but to understand something and to be able to explain it simply, you need to dig deep and understand it at its core. That we're in that phase now. The tools are available to try and understand how the brain changes throughout development in mental illness, and try to figure out what the factors are to be able to come back out and to explain it in simple terms because of that deeper understanding. I think making, as you've done just now, people aware of their control of their brain is an important step. Mental health is in our power to control, but it comes from this deeper understanding that we're in the midst of accumulating right now, so we need to keep working on that.
I guess one of the things that I find powerful is that this kind of work teaches us something about compassion for each other, about the fact that there are these individual differences that we all come to the table with, and whether that's because of genetic variation or experiences that we've had, and trying to sort of enter somebody else's world first by recognizing that is true. Is a difficult thing to do many times, but it's an important thing to do. We sort of sometimes assume that we're all approaching the same problem with the same lens, and that's really not true. Related to that, I think one thing that Takao's work and others have made clear to me is that certainly early in life, but throughout life, we can contribute to each other's mental health in pretty powerful ways. That what we were talking about with early adversity, with kids who are in environments that are difficult or have been in traumatic environments, that lack of consistency or perhaps nurturing or opportunities for that is obvious, but also in ways that are less obvious in all of our lives. Providing support and compassion, and if you're a parent, this kind of consistency and nurturing environment is a really pretty powerful thing, and long-lastingly so.
I don't know how anyone else feels, but I know how many questions I have. So, do people have questions? Because I don't want to. I hope I speak for all of us. I think it would be a good time to ask questions. If you don't have any, we can ramble on.
First question right here. First question here.
Thank you all for a really good. I can speak up.
Can you hear me? Yeah. This thing only listens to loud voices. Thank you all very much. It was amazing to be led in through the different pathways to this same idea. I wonder how you think about the fact that we somehow seem to be genetically wired to have such a preponderance of what we're calling mental illness in our society. And I gather it's true across all societies. It's not just this particular one. I've thought about it, and I wonder whether these are just sort of extreme examples of genes that are otherwise useful, that we have too much of in some way.
So I'm sure we can all I could just give a very quick input on that one, from the point of view of our the fight and flight response. Anyone who flinched then, from our early DNA, the fight and flight response is one of our strongest responses. And the Pinker line about how, what's the 5 words? The
Brain cells fire in patterns.
Brain cells fire in patterns. Brain cells fire in patterns about bad things much more than they do about good things. 10 pieces of good news will have less impact on the neuron firing in the brain than 1 piece of bad news. It's almost as if we're overstimulated by the fight and flight mechanism. It serves us well, but this is an oversimplification. But why is it that as we've created more ease in society, depression is on the increase? It's as if somehow from an evolution point of view, we're still doing catch-up on it. There are those who are anti-medication who would argue that the use of medication has slowed down our natural evolution. But that's why I get into slightly dangerous territory, and it's not my opinion, it's simply what I'm listening to people saying. Jordan, Takao.
Well, I would say I agree with your essential point, which is that many of the things that we refer to as psychiatric disorders are in some ways variations of the same systems that we use to navigate everyday life. These are things like, even if you think about the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, those mechanisms of laying down memories, of figuring out what's dangerous and needs to be avoided, what needs to be really remembered, has obvious survival value and evolutionary value, and so we all have those mechanisms. But for some of us, our sensitivity to it may be dialed up or down a little bit, and maybe because that's counterbalanced by something else. I'm not sure I would say we're wired to have so much mental illness. I would say, though, that we all have within us this, this variation that sometimes can lead to difficulties when it's in the extreme, or when the environment is such that even adapting to it in a way that makes sense causes us problems.
Well, my perspective has been developmental brain plasticity. And these critical or sensitive periods that I mentioned, we study in the laboratory. They are obvious from mouse to human. And the basic biology, we believe, behind them is essentially the same. So why is it that we, as humans, are encountering more mental illness, perhaps, than a mouse? I don't know if that's true, but I could, if you allow me to speculate. This is the gene-environment interaction at its finest. Humans are able to control and change their environment very quickly. And maybe these evolutionarily conserved mechanisms of allowing great plasticity early in life and then clamping down on it later is something that was very adaptive for creatures that live in limited environments with shorter lifespan. And it could be that as we've conquered longevity and are able to travel to foreign lands in the blink of an eye, or take chemicals to change that all-important excitatory-inhibitory balance in our brains moment by moment, we're starting to encounter the limitations or the biological limitations of these kinds of critical periods that have evolved and stayed with us as animals. So, there are a variety of important things that came up in just the last talk. How hard it is for us to know the environment and experience of any one of these people. Then they were given drugs which are acting on these very same mechanisms. And then we're going in to try and cure them of some problem. And at any given moment, these subjects have been in more or less plastic state. The trajectories that should come in this nice sequence or hierarchy have been no doubt disrupted. And to recreate that post hoc is a very big challenge. And so, of course, I'm speculating, but the view we're taking is that the basic biology of the brain is essentially conserved, and the way in which we're using it may be changing dramatically. And this is what's pushing us into these different directions of mental illness.
Okay, great. Next question over here.
For any or all of you, what would you recommend that we teach children about brain health?
That's an interesting question. There's a new journal, Frontiers in Neuroscience for Kids. And I suggest you take a look at this. This is a journal where kids act as the reviewers. And it encourages them to help people write clearly and explain these concepts to them. I would answer your question by reading the articles that they have reviewed, the questions that they're interested in. Of course, these articles run, what you might expect. What is the impact of video games on brain development? I think what we want to tell kids is that their brain is highly plastic. This is a window of opportunity, and we don't want to stress them out with that because it's also a window of vulnerability, and you can make the most of this period of time to really hone your skills, but also avoid lifelong disabilities. So, I think it's our experienced post-critical period brain that has been shaped by a former generation, which is now trying to raise this generation to deal with a future that we can't even begin to imagine what it would be like. So it's very difficult to answer your question except to empower them and to tell them that this is a precious time, provide them opportunities, and prevent these vulnerabilities from ever taking hold.
Yeah, and I guess I would say also that having them think of their brain health as a part of their health, the importance of protecting their brains. That's a whole important area of avoiding injury. But also, I think one of the most wonderful things about childhood is kind of curiosity and openness, and that is a very healthy thing. And I think inspiring and encouraging that kind of playfulness of the brain and use of the brain, treating it like something that is precious and theirs, and they are empowered to be part of shaping the way it turns out is an important thing. I think the other things that I mentioned also I think are important of helping people to realize that we all have different brains, that we have, we're all different a little bit. That doesn't mean that, something's better than something else. And in fact, to appreciate those differences and to find ways to help other people and help them find answers to things or find answers to the struggles that they have, that's an important power that you have to not only take care of your brain, but to take care of other people's brains.
We're running programs in primary schools in Kashmir, and primary schools there are very different to how they are here, kind of under a tree. And the way we're working with children, a lot of whom are from illiterate backgrounds, is we give the children physical experiences. So again, back to this idea of Hippocrates, connecting the mind and the body, physical experiences, and ask them to explore what it feels like physically and how it makes them feel mentally as well. And then to create their own dialogue between the two, their own understanding, making them understand that it will be individual to them, and discussing how differently they experience it between themselves. And that we have found exactly in the spirit of inquiry of a child's mind is very effective. The actual experience of it themselves, not so much being told as in what do you know about this, but how has it changed you? And that we are finding very effective in the context of Kashmir.
Next question here.
Yeah, this is directed at Jordan, but would take input from anyone. I was a little surprised the slide with the faces with the different emotions, and it went from angry to sad, for example, on the bottom. And you said that the control group, by the second or third one, stopped seeing the anger, but the group of children who had had rather difficult childhoods continued to see it, and you said that they were sort of very good at noticing anger. And I thought that actually they were not very good at figuring out when things weren't angry because they got disorganized feedback and didn't get mirroring and all that kind of stuff. So can you talk about that a little?
That's a good question. So, I think that that was one experiment. There have been other experiments where, for example, you take a facial image that's degraded, where you can't really make sense of it, and you morph it into an expression. And again, the kids who'd been maltreated could pick up the emotional expression when it was anger much quicker. So in that case, they were actually perceiving it more quickly. But I think you're right. I mean, you could look at that as they're inaccurate in a sense. They're overshooting. They're overcalling it. And there is always, in all areas of many things in medicine and testing, there's this trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. How sensitive are you to something versus how easily do you reject that something is there. And so their gain is turned up. There were elements of anger there because the faces were going from 0 to 100%. So they were still seeing the anger when there was only 30% of an angry expression there. But you could, that is sort of the double-edged sword, that they're tuned in to seeing things that other people may not be able to see. But in day-to-day life, we might say that's just overcalling it. That's not an angry expression.
Okay, next question's over here.
Well, hello. Excuse me. Yes, I have a question on treatment and what your thoughts would be of the Blue Brain project out of Switzerland, and also your thoughts on hyperbolic temporal discounting curve being used to treat mental illness in the future.
Well, so on the Blue Brain project, there are a number of very large-scale projects that are going on in Europe and now in the United States to sort of really map out the very basic properties of how the brain works and the computational properties. And there is, fortunately, a pretty good investment of money in these times when money is not being invested that much in science to do this. I think that's one example of that. The second question about hyperbolic temporal discounting is one that I'm not sure I can answer because I don't have any experience with that in terms of treatment, though.
Not available to us where I'm working.
Well, I think what you're seeing is the era of big data has arrived in neuroscience, whether it's genomic or connectomic data, and we need serious efforts to try and make sense of that. The Swiss project, the European project, is trying to make a high-powered computer that can simulate this complex cortical network. This is a very admirable goal if you can try to understand the computation of these patterns of activity that race through circuits that have been identified. But will it lead to new discoveries about new molecules? I think that's highly unlikely, since you're not looking at the real brain. For example, I told you about brake-like factors that limit plasticity, and it wasn't until just within the past 5 or 6 years that people started focusing on the space between neurons, factors that fill the gaps between these excitatory and inhibitory neurons, full of molecules that will prevent rewiring. And that kind of discovery would not be possible without basic biological research. So both are important, of course. We're having to face this avalanche of data and trying to make sense of that. And so these kinds of projects would allow us to take a stab at this. And at the same time, we need bottom-up discovery science that allows us to find these new players and new ideas. Even the notion that inhibition was directing traffic was not very popular, I should say, about 10, 15 years ago, where people who are studying in a reductionist way excitatory connections would routinely block all inhibition in order to study just that. And so this is the way science works, and we need a variety of approaches. So I'm glad, as Jordan said, that brain science is in the forefront, at least in these projects.
And last question over here.
In your opinion, is evolution being slowed by all the psychological illnesses that are being discovered?
Well, I wouldn't say that. No, I mean I think that evolution and natural selection has been going on for some time. There is some interest in this question of why we do know, for example, that certain psychiatric conditions are associated with having fewer children. And so one question, like neurodevelopmental disorders or schizophrenia. So one question people have sometimes asked is, if there is this genetic component, how does it persist? And part of the answer to that is that was a point raised by one of the questioners before, which is that some of the genes that we have that influence illness are also ones that are doing other things, and those variants may be helpful in ways that that counterbalance some of their effects. The other is that we see that some variants, genetic contributions to these disorders, arise de novo, as it's called in the field, meaning that they aren't necessarily inherited, but occur in the formation of the gametes and the embryo and so on. And so some of these variations, these are rare variations that can strongly influence illness, are mutations that occur in the population just over time, recurrently.
Again, from my experience, I'm sorry, where is the person who asked the question? Yeah, I don't want to look in the wrong place. Slightly throw this into a different direction. Not major depressive disorders, but our experience of standard depression, I think in some ways is misunderstood. It builds a resilience in us. It is not pleasant to go through. But if we have a philosophical understanding of it, a lot of these forms of depression are driven by the great existential questions. What is the meaning of my life? Fear of death, the huge sort of what's the point of it all? If we allowed ourselves, and this is the question I ask really in response to your question, if we allowed ourselves to explore these without being so fearful of them, if we were able to deal with the stigma more, would we create our own form of evolution? Is our fear holding us back from using bearable depression as a way of going to a deeper philosophical level, a deeper understanding of ourselves? I don't know. It's a question that we're looking at, because in our experience, again, in a conflict, when we are allowing people to address these questions, it is creating a mental resilience in them.
Well, in as much as human brains generate experiences that then shape other human brains, I think we are not slowing evolution, we are driving it. The fact that we are understanding even the tiniest bit about how our brains are shaped by experience will, of course, lead to a time when we can maybe even control brain plasticity at some level and the way in which our brain function changes. I ended my talk with a quote from Baudelaire about the ability to control a childlike mind at will. Well, certain aspects of mental illness are colored by genius, and some breakthroughs and create creativity and imagination that we see in human society and culture may actually spring forth from these kinds of conditions. So it's a very interesting question, but I think I would like to think it's driving evolution forward in very interesting ways.
Well, that was really interesting, fascinating.